everybody. Thanks for joining our Research Quality Matters Explorer session. Today we have really interesting topic to present to you, and I see some exciting. It's exciting that I see some new faces and familiar faces. Good to see you all. So the topic that we'll be discussing today is enhancing diversity in clinical trials, challenges and solutions. So in this presentation, Munaza and Sarah will be sharing their experiences and viewpoints as they work towards building a more inclusive and diverse landscape for clinical trials in Canada. They'll be discussing the challenges and the potential solutions for improving diverse clinical trials participation, the importance of a diverse clinical research workforce, and how N2 is working to help meet the challenge of improving EDI in clinical research. So joining us today, we have Sarah Bridges, our research coordinator for Maritime Sports Support Unit. Just to tell you a little bit about Sarah, I'm sure most of us know her fairly well. So she has master's in applied health services research from UMB, and during her master's, she completed her research residency with the MB Heart Center, gaining experience in data collection and analysis in clinical settings. Sarah is supporting patient-oriented research initiatives through planning, development, and implementation in our research community. She also holds N2 co-chair position for the Clinical Trials Education and Awareness Committee. And another important guest, we have very special guest. Her name is Munaza Jamil. She's a program lead, quality assurance and monitoring in Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network. She's with McMaster University. Munaza has 22 years of experience in the world of clinical research, mostly in the academic healthcare setting. And she is also a faculty member at McMaster University, where she teaches clinical trials courses at the postgraduate level. She holds the N2 co-chair position for the Clinical Trials Education and Awareness Committee. And she is also ACRP Canada Executive Board member. And obviously, she's very passionate about this topic of improving diversity in clinical trials. Welcome, Munaza and Sarah. I'll hand over to you. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So we're speaking on enhancing diversity in clinical trials, speaking on the challenges and some of the solutions. So just to start us all off with a bit of a quote, beyond the moral imperative ensuring equity among access to clinical trials, the concept of good science is critical. So this was said by Kent Folk at a conference on increasing diversity in clinical trials. Just a quick agenda to go through. We're going to just touch on some definitions just in case this is a new topic for you, and just start to think about some of the terminology that we use. We'll speak on barriers to participating, some facilitators and strategies that you can use to improve diversity in your clinical trial participation, and then some touching on some diversity in the clinical trials or clinical research workforce. And then, of course, because Munaza and I are both the co-chairs for the N2 Clinical Trials Education and Awareness Committee, we are going to speak to the contribution in our future directions that we're going to be taking. So what do they mean? So where diversity refers to the traits and characteristics of people, inclusion will refer to the behaviors and practices that ensure that these individuals and groups are valued, permitting diversity to flourish. And then equitable policies will strive to ensure that all individuals have equal access to the same opportunities, regardless of where they started, their background, or their identity. So we're really working through these three EDI principles, but it's just starting to think about what equity is, the difference between that and diversity and inclusion. All right, so of course, there is a lot of different terms that we use. It's hard to decipher, what is the correct term, and some of them, of course, are a bit more inclusive than others. So when we're speaking on EDI, we're first and foremost trying to think of what these terms might indicate about the group that we're speaking about. So something like hard to reach that's on the screen right now, it might imply that they're hiding from participation, where the onus is being put on them to be reached rather than on us to reach them and find them. So they're all, trying to be respectful and trying to, address the similar concepts. There's some that might work a little better, and this might actually differ based on the group that you're trying to reach or target. So it's always best, to go towards those groups and those communities services that they might have and use the language that they're working on. So just a deeper look on a few of these terms. So marginalized might refer to people who have been historically excluded due to race, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, language, or immigration status. Minority groups are those groups that are traditionally underrepresented, also historically marginalized. And overlooked individuals are those who are unable to articulate their needs, such as individuals with mental illness, caregivers, maybe they have dementia or something along those lines. And then service resistant can refer to individuals who may be distrustful or suspicious of service providers due to historical misconduct that their communities have faced in the past. So, all of the unethical research that we hear about when we're going through our ethics training, those groups might be service resistant or research resistant. And then just another term is intersectionality. So it's important to consider that while we all fall onto this wheel in certain areas, of course, there's pieces of it that might have more power or are more marginalized. And it's important to consider that every person has a different level of being marginalized or, having a bit more power, something along those lines. And really what I want to encourage you to do is just consider where you stand on this. So, for example, myself, I'm female, non-Christian, white. I have a partner. I speak English. So I have a fair bit of privilege, although I am still a female. So there's intersectionality of marginalization, and just considering what topics that you're researching, especially in the realm of this wheel, can help to target different individuals. So why do we care? Why is diversity in clinical trials important? And just think back to that quote on, of course, it's moral. There's a moral imperative, but it's also the concept of good science. So it might seem obvious, but some subgroups of individuals may respond differently to different therapies. So we need to consider, how genetics play a role, how a treatment may or may not affect current or future pregnancies, people in their living situations, maybe their interactions with others in their community or within the healthcare system, and how a disease might spread to those groups. We saw a lot of this in COVID-19 and how it spread a little faster in certain marginalized groups. And all of these play a role in the efficacy of clinical trials and, of course, of research in general. And then it also plays a role in the adherence to, say, a drug regimen or a fitness regimen that we're pushing. So, for example, cystic fibrosis is a largely genetic disease, and there's a new drug treatment out that works really well for certain children with this specific gene mutation. However, this gene mutation is largely seen in white European descent people, or if they have partially white genetics. So there's little pockets across the world of different gene mutations. So there's one in China and there's one in Ethiopia, and they differ from the gene mutation that's typically seen in a white population. So what this ends up being is that we have this great treatment for white children or children who have the European DNA, but then there's large populations of people who are being completely missed out. And this is in part due to them not being able to participate in clinical trials. But ultimately, we need to increase our diversity in clinical trials to increase equitable access to healthcare. So access to clinical trials has been associated with longer survival and better outcomes in people living with cancer. And we need to make these clinical trials available to everyone, because ultimately not doing so is not being equitable in our healthcare, which is, as Canadians, of course, something we pride ourselves on. So a few barriers that we're going to speak to. So they're sort of in 4 different realms. So it's a person's understanding of research. Do they know what's available to them? Do they know the safeguards in place? Some personal influences, different cultural practices, how far away they live from the study site. Have they had previous negative experiences or those contextual factors? And then, of course, research process barriers, like the language of informed consent, exclusion criteria that might hinder people with different cultural practices from participating. So first up is research understanding. So this might include different ideas such as the lack of awareness. Do they even know about the research? Do they understand sort of the ethical safeguards that we've now put in place to keep them safe, to make sure they're entirely informed? Do they think there's a benefit to participating in research or a clinical trial? And what about the reputation of that research institution? Has it previously, been sort of an issue point for this group? Some personal influences. So this could be cultural differences, community practices, or religious practices or beliefs. So something along the lines of tobacco being sacred in an Indigenous culture. Sometimes tobacco use or smoking is an exclusion criteria. So that is entirely a group of people that can't participate in that trial. Caregiver roles. This is both on the side of a caregiver participating, but also on the patient. So if the caregiver can't bring them to and from, if they have sort of that imbalance between them, or if the caregiver doesn't understand or trust. So again, objections from a family member. And of course, clinical trials and participating in research sometimes can be pretty time consuming and can change up their routine quite a bit. So sometimes that's just not possible. And then another one just to consider as well is if a patient actually has a mailing address or a telephone number. So if they're not sure if they have transient living situations, sometimes that completely excludes them because they can't get things in the mail. They can't receive the phone call to come in for their study visit. They can't answer certain surveys that might be online, different ideas of that. Of course, the contextual factors and historical context. So, if they've had previous negative experiences as participants or as patients just in the medical community, fear of abuse and exploitation, and of authority. So, of course, all of the previous research, the Tuskegee syphilis study, things like that. So there's a bit of a disconnect and a trust that really needs to be built. So of course, this barrier is a bit more work to overcome. And finally, the understanding of research. So this includes things like study design, inclusion criteria, logistics, lack of resources, and researcher beliefs. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, inclusion criteria, if they can't smoke tobacco, that's excluding people who use tobacco as a sacred element. People with comorbid conditions, and of course this makes sense for research. We need to have that as part of the design to control for extraneous variables, but it is something to consider if we're trying to reach minority populations or underserved populations. Similarly, the logistics of a informed consent protocol and how we go around that, and the language of that. So sometimes that can be a barrier in and of itself. It's, of course, a lot of very specific research language that we need in there. But there's a way, I guess, to make this a bit more understandable and a bit more welcoming. Great, I'll pass it over to Munaza.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'll just maybe have you help me toggle through the slides then? Okay,
Yes.
so we're going to move on to the section where we would like to present some possible strategies to improve diversity and to overcome the barriers that Sarah was just mentioning. Next slide. Barriers are a downstream phenomena. So if we talk about inclusivity with a predominant question, with a primary question, and deal with this upstream, these barriers that we articulate in the moment would be much less difficult to overcome, and something to ponder. So I guess the first thing is just to talk about patient engagement, and when we're talking to patients about possible trials and their participation in possible projects, we want to make sure, of course, that we do develop a good relationship and a good rapport early on in the timeline. And this is not just between the staff and potential participants, but it's on a larger scale where we would like healthcare organizations that are conducting clinical trials to really reach out and engage with the communities that they're located in. So this would mean that you would be having a good rapport and good open relationships with leaders of the different communities, and and the individuals, of course, the population that makes up those communities, so that they are very well known to you, you're well known to them, and that goes a long way towards building trust and overcoming some of those barriers as well. We also want to make sure that when we do publish materials or documents related to our trials, that we are avoiding using language that could be perceived as stigmatizing. So we want to just be very careful about the language that we're using and the verbiage that is being included. We, of course, always want to use lay language, language that is easily understood by all, but also just to talk about some terminology. Instead of saying interview, we might want to say something like an assessment. And there's many examples of that, but just to be mindful of that step as well. And then talking about written and published materials, we also want to make sure that the images that we display and portray and embed as part of those materials also are visually representing the types of populations that you want to include in your trials. So we want pictures of individuals from various ethnicities and races and backgrounds. If you're having a study where you'd like to like to recruit elderly patients, maybe having those pictures represented. So these are very important things to think about, that sometimes, it kind of gets overlooked because we're so busy trying to maybe, map out our study plans and write up those manuals and just worry about the target enrollment and things like that. But these things can go a long way towards your recruitment. And then likewise, when we're trying to think about recruitment and retention of patients, we want to talk about potential motivations. So we want to, of course, make sure that incentives are not coercive. We want to also understand what the cultural differences are in the individuals across the populations that we're trying to recruit. And so have maybe a few options as incentives and motivations to participate. Also, another big motivation for a lot of people, and especially those who are typically coming from an underrepresented population or an underserved population, is that being part of that clinical trial is going to enable them to get a bigger picture of how their overall health status is. So a lot of these communities do not have access to even very basic primary health care. And so let's say that they don't, and they have been maybe referred to a specialist at a hospital nearby, at a community hospital that happens to conduct clinical trials as well. And so when they participate in this clinical trial, if you're able to give them results of their labs, perhaps, or other tests that you're doing clinically and also using for research purposes, that also is a motivator for a lot of people, because they feel like, okay, well, maybe through this research, I'll be able to track my diabetes better, or I'll be able to track my hypertension, or if it's a risk factor for cardiac disease, whatever kind of trial it is. So feedback on individual data is very important. Of course, they should have access to their own files and records. And we also want to make sure within that conversation to help them understand who the true owner of that data is, and be very transparent about where their data is going. Because even though we're coming from a perspective where we're very well versed in terms of what policies and guidelines surround data collection and data storage and data transfers and things like that, we have to understand that individuals who are outside of the research enterprise don't necessarily have any idea of where this data goes. And there might be a lot of mistrust, especially in immigrant communities where they've come from a place or a country where there was not that much trust with authority. So they might be very suspicious about that. And I feel like just having conversations and discussions will alleviate a lot of those and help build the trust. And then, of course, there's altruistic motivations, which goes for any population at all. And, this is just that you're going to participate and you're going to help further advance medical progress and scientific progress in medicine. And this is going to help future generations of people who may be living with the same types of conditions or diseases that you are. And I feel with that as well, if we take a moment and really try to educate the population on the relevance of the research to their um, population, so to their ethnicity, people of their age group maybe, or their race, or however it applies and becomes relevant to them, that would go a long way as well. Building trust, so that's what the underlying theme really. Like I said before, build a rapport and a relationship with an established, maybe a community advisory board or leaders of different communities, faith-based communities, etc. And that way you'll also learn a lot on what is culturally appropriate within that community to talk about, to not talk about. There are sometimes some topics where some communities don't like to have, if it's related to perhaps women's health, they don't like to have a male audience when you're talking about those issues. They would prefer that you as a researcher would come and address women directly and only them, because that's not something that they talk about, as a family perhaps, or as a community at large. So these are types of culturally appropriate takeaways that we can learn as well. And then, of course, we want to secure endorsement, like I said, community leaders, service agencies who might be serving these clients from these populations, and even physicians who are their primary care physicians, perhaps, who are seeing these individuals in their clinics every single day. If you secure your endorsement from them, that goes a long way towards enabling that trust to build. Caregivers are an integral part of a patient's life sometimes. And so a lot of times you want your family to be there. And especially if you're somebody who is new to the country, new to the language, new to the culture, or in general, just someone who is not very participatory in society, you might have you might feel better if somebody was with you to talk about your participation in a clinical trial and answer those questions, etc. Especially those who have language barriers. And so this is very, very important. And obviously, you do want to get the permission from the participant, but you also want to be mindful of the fact that you may have to include both the participant and the caregiver or a family member in those conversations. And that can go a long way. And I'll give you an example. So I'm a caregiver to my mother, who is living with cancer. And we have been approached, several times over the year, 2 years or so, for different types of studies and different types of trials during our visits to the hospital. And one of the times, there was a research nurse who came to us in the waiting room, and she approached us and talked to us a little bit about the project. And my mom, kind of turned to me, looked at me to say, "Can you answer these questions or so?" And when I started to speak, the nurse kind of like shut me down and said, "You know what? No, I'm talking to your mom. She's the patient. She's the one I need to hear from." And so when my mom kind of heard that, she thought that this is something that's going to continue. So if I do participate, they're always going to ask me to be the person to speak. And I'm not comfortable, not with the language, not with understanding what's happening. And so I'm just going to say, no, I don't want to be a part of this because my daughter isn't feeling very welcome and I'm not feeling very comfortable without her. And so that kind of went into our decision making in that moment. And that was, of course, unknown to the nurse. But that's a lesson, right? Is that you don't want to turn off people by kind of like, taking away their support systems. Um, and then, of course, you should have a plan to locally disseminate the results of your study as well. So go back to them at the end and say, "Hey, listen, thank you so much for participating. Look at what we've learned, and this is going to go a long way to further our knowledge and progress our therapies for this condition or disease or whatever." These are just some other ideas and options to build trust. I won't go through every single one of them, but like I've said, the overall theme is that we want to be sensitive to cultural differences. We want to train our staff and our researchers to that cultural sensitivity and cultural competence when approaching research. And then there's also value in matching ethnicity matching or gender matching the research staff to the targeted population. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the diversity of the workforce. Next slide. Education, as I mentioned before, so about the study topic, the larger condition, include testimonies of former participants if needed, reassure people on privacy, on the SOPs that exist that will support our process, and that will also help build confidence and trust. One size does not fit all. Canada is an amazing country where we do have a real mix of many, many different cultures, ethnicities, backgrounds, etc. And that does require sort of different strategies and customized approaches. So every culture has their own challenges, barriers, concerns, depending on their backgrounds and their educations and things like that. So cultural competence is key. Community-based recruitment. So like I said, I've talked about it a little bit more. You want to be a little bit more flexible. You want to use these recruitment techniques that foster in-person interaction because that also builds trust. So active solutions towards recruitment and retention as opposed to passive, which would mean like you put out a poster and you hang it up in a family care clinic and you hope that people will read it and contact you, as opposed to you going to the physician who's serving those clients and say, "Hey, listen, I have a research study. Would you mind taking 2 minutes? Maybe if you find somebody who's eligible, could you talk to them about this poster and point them in the direction of the research team?" And then, of course, you want to be flexible in terms of allowing those participants to take part in your study. And that would mean, giving them some flexibility around assessment times and offering different types of solutions for visits. So hybrid versus in person or whatever can be done to fit that person's lifestyle and current schedule. So of course, all of these things, they take time, they take money. There's some very real implications, and we're not saying that it's not. There's a higher cost, of course, for all of these different recruitment strategies. There's a higher cost of time as well that it'll take for you to go and build these relationships. More collaboration is needed, and of course, that takes time as well. There's also a higher need for transparency and sharing the lessons that have been learned. So if there are study teams across the country that are employing some of these strategies, we want to hear back from them as well, and we want them to share their lessons learned so that people can sort of cross-pollinate their ideas and strategies and pull them together to make the overall research enterprise more successful. And then, of course, you will also need to recruit sufficient numbers of diverse participants for a publication and to have meaningful results from a study. So it's not like, you would just be able to take maybe one person from this race and one person from that country and say, hey, my study is really diverse. It's not like that, right? Like there has to be a whole plan. So all of this does take time, and there's some real implications for it. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but equally important as it is to enroll diverse populations into our clinical trials is the fact that we really need to build diversity in our clinical research workforce as well. And that just really, to me, is a natural sort of thing. So if somebody who looks like myself, I meet with them at the hospital and I approach them for a study, because that woman is able to reflect herself in who I am, I think there will be a higher level of trust and understanding between us when we have that conversation, as opposed to somebody who may not be. But that's not just set in stone. That's just a thought, and it does science does show that it does work like that. So if you have gender matching staff, you have ethnicity matching staff, it does go a long way. And also, I mean, the diversity in the workforce is going to bring really good, fresh, unique perspectives into our work as well. And that will also enable us to design trials that are more inclusive and embracing diversity. So what can you do to diversify your workplace? You want to understand, first of all, you want to self-reflect. You want to talk about what are your own unique perspectives that you bring to the table. Do you have any unconscious biases? That's, diversity consultants will tell you that's pretty much the first exercise that you should be taking, and really exploring your inner self and understanding that there might be some unconscious biases that you hold that you don't even know that you have. And I'll give you an example. A very common one is when you approach an elderly person, you'll start to talk louder because you'll think that they won't be able to hear you. So, or it happens to me a lot is when I go to the hospital with my mom, people will approach us and start talking not just loudly, but also very slowly because they'll assume that we don't know English. And it's completely an unconscious bias that they have, is that people who maybe they look like me, maybe the color of my skin, the way I dress, they would feel that I wouldn't know English. So they will start to speak very, very slow to help me understand. And then they'll be very pleasantly surprised when I do open my mouth and I start to speak. So these types of things we want to think about and self-reflect. We also want to start then that conversation with others around us. We want to talk to our coworkers and our, the leadership in the organization as well, and encourage them to do the same. And then we also want to search for adequate, appropriate education opportunities and training opportunities. Oftentimes now organizations do have in-house diversity consultants and EDI leaders that you can help, you can sort of bring them on and get them to support you as you work through this process. And then also look at other opportunities that are out there so that you can become more culturally competent.
Yeah, this was just, a paper, just some interviews from clinical trials leaders and trying to get a more diverse workforce. So, it's, of course, the culture and the leadership of the institution is critical and very important. If we don't have that sort of buy-in from the top down, it's going to be challenging right from the beginning. But mostly, the main point on this slide is just start somewhere and commit. We're not going to change the world, especially as just single people, but just trying to start anywheres and just keep going with that is really where the takeaway from this slide.
So we've talked about patient recruitment and patient engagement, and of course, we've all heard about patient and public partners. And a lot of organizations now, a lot of study teams will engage and request support from public and patient partners when they are about to, design their trial and all the way through the life cycle of the study as well. And these are really, really important, valuable resources. I just want to say and emphasize that it's also important to build diversity into this group so that you are able to receive various perspectives, a variety of different perspectives that will enable you to build a successful study. So as mentioned at the beginning, Sarah and I are co-chairs of the Clinical Trials Education and Awareness Committee at N2. And as such, there is some work that we're doing through the committee to address this topic. I'll just start very quickly to give you an overview and understanding of what N2 is. I'm pretty sure everybody already is aware, but N2 is basically a not-for-profit that is working across Canada to enhance clinical research capability. And it does provide a platform to share best practices. A lot of times you'll hear that N2 provides SOPs for clinical research that a lot of institutions have adapted. And then also resources and research-related content to ensure that high-quality research is being done in Canada. And it is a national voice, like I mentioned before. So there are 5 committees actually that N2 has, and these are the names, and we are co-chairs of the first one. Basically, the objective of the committee is to create and execute a national clinical trials education awareness strategy. We want to develop materials to support these initiatives, including a website that has already been launched for a number of years. It starts with me.ca and other materials as well. We want to develop a framework to increase the public's knowledge and understanding about clinical trials and research. And then we have also developed some pediatric specific informative material, including a clinical trials video that was called The Participators, which is like a small video, a cartoon type video that really speaks to children about participation in clinical trials. So I would really recommend and encourage you to go to the website and please check out the video. It's actually won a couple of awards as well. So in the recent months, our committee was busy submitting a proposal to CIHR for some funding through their Café Scientifique program. And so we were awarded this grant a couple of months ago, early in the summer. And the idea is that we are going to be holding a workshop. It's a public engagement event for new immigrants to Canada, and to talk about what are the barriers that they face in terms of accessing health-related research and clinical research. And after talking about those challenges and barriers, then we want to talk about what can we do to facilitate their access and how. This is going to actually be held in about 3 weeks' time. It's going to be in Toronto. We are really hoping that the idea is behind the Café Scientifique, that we would be using this as a pilot for future, such workshops and community consultations across Canada. And we're really hoping to hear from that population and then share our findings as well with other groups. One of the things that we really want to do in this regard as part of the committee's work is we want to create diversity-specific materials for members to engage diverse voices in clinical trials, engage the diverse population in the design of clinical trials materials. And then, of course, we want to recruit and engage the individuals from diverse populations for membership within the CTA committee. So one of the things I wanted to just say is that the committees are open to volunteers. So anybody who wants to join a committee literally just has to go on the website and fill up a form, and the committee co-chairs will contact you and onboard you, and then you'll start to attend the meetings and contribute to the work that committee is doing. These are our socials. And that's our pictures. And I think that's it, right? Okay.